The Transparent Garden. The fighter was in a garden. A beautiful garden decorated with ornate archways and a kaleidoscope of flowers. Some that the fighter recognized from his hometown. The blooming sunflower was his wife's favorites. The vibrant fuzz that was lavender, his personal favorite, wrapped around the sunflower in a natural forming bouquet. The fighter looked around in his new environment. In the sky, there was nothing but a sea of bright blue hanging up in the sun in the center. Cautiously taking in a slow breath, all he could smell was the flowers. Generally, he could always smell at least a hint of sweat or blood that lingered on him. But it was no longer there. The scent of flowers had washed it away. The fighter quickly glanced down at himself, inspecting his armor and equipment for any damage. The rust and chips on his blade were polished and sharp. The dents and holes in his armor were gone. It had returned to its former glory when he first bought them. He moved his limbs and body, testing out the muscles and reaction time, while the bruises and knots that had weaved themselves together underneath his skin were gone. The fighter was loose and limber for the first time in a long time. The fighter started to trace back how he got to this garden. He had no memory of how he got here or what brought him here. He could have sworn he was doing something else, something important. The fighter was sure of it. Last night he was talking to his party. They were devising a plan for a fight or a mission. He couldn't remember. His head swayed around like a half-filled barrel of ale. He scanned the new environment cautiously, gripping the handle of his sword. As history and experience have taught him, never trust a quiet place. He's been ambushed in said places too many times to count. Well, look who's finally here. The fighter jolted up from the ground a little, drawing his clean blade from his side. The sharpened edge raised and angled toward the direction of the voice, only guided by instincts and muscle memory now. The instincts were soon washed away when he saw the source of the voice standing by an archway several feet away. A small crate of a person wearing a fur-lined duster with a hood crudely sewn to the collar. They had leggings that seemed to be a bit too baggy and a sapphire string shirt that reflected the sun. A thin face framed a pair of purple eyes and a crooked mouth smiled at him. The person held a thick, leather-worn book in their arms, long, frizzy maple hair poking out from under the hood. Hey! The fighter smiled, putting his sword down to his side. His nerves finally settled seeing a friend. Where are... Everyone's waiting for us, the hooded friend said, walking under the archway. Come on. Hey, wait, LaRue! The fighter chased after his friend, running through the rose hedge archway. His legs felt limber and light for the first time in years. The worn-down scale armor and boots generally left a dragging heaviness, but it was gone. He felt energetic, young, strong. He was sure sometime before he was the furthest away from these feelings. LaRue! The fighter called out, picking up speed to catch up, only a few steps away from his friend. What? LaRue laughed, looking over their shoulder. Do I have to carry you now, Orlean? The fighter smirked, making a face behind LaRue's skull. You're gonna have to do more than that from all the times I've saved you. Bright neon sparks flew up behind LaRue's shoulder, shooting an annoyed glance towards Orlean. Orlean merely responded with a giant bellow of a laugh, glancing around the environment on their path. The grass had beds of morning glories, all bloomed and vibrant. The soft violet colors with the dark purple streaks brought back memories of his wife, another one of his wife's favorites. It's how he proposed to her, with a basket of food and a crudely made flower crown of morning glories. She laughed but loved the offer. Orlean always promised to grab some whenever he was on an adventure. He would make a mental note to grab some before moving on. Orlean was about to ask how they got here, remembering that they were leaving a tavern, but as he was going to speak, LaRue slowed down. Finally catching up with his friend, he saw what was in front of them. The rest of the party sitting in a small patch of grass, chatting and laughing. A hulking gray figure with dark spiraled spiked tattoos danced their way up from his neck into the bridge of his eyes. Dark black hairs poked out of a beaten bowler hat while his mismatched color eyes were smiling as he downed another swig of a half-empty bottle. Light-tinted glasses were pushed up to the bridge on the broken nose of the man. A bright gold band snugged on his ring finger as he tapped the bottle. The beaten old shirt seemed baggy enough to let him move freely as he swayed around. Sitting next to the colorful hulk was a roundish bottle of a man donned in chipped chainmail. The polished and dented plate mail he always wore was set beside him. Only his sword was on him. Light blue fingers wiped down the blade with a ratted oak cloth. Keeping to the routine of cleaning the sword he always kept by him, casually clutching the handle of skeleton hand and wings while deep blue eyes watched his giant friend. Long gray hair tumbled down to his shoulders. A small braid from the side of his head had a small coin braided through it. A light blue tail curled around an unopened bottle out of the Hulk's sight. Belvy and Mariah, Orlean's party members. Orlean could feel a rush of relief pouring down his spine, spreading to the rest of his limbs, letting go of the knots and bruises that had embedded into his muscles. "Hey, guys!" Orlean spoke up, joy wavering his voice. The Hulk with the bowler hat glanced up and flashed a beaming grin. The red and black eyes shined and dulled from the alcohol. "You finally showed up! You finally showed up!" Belvy cheered, raising his bottle to the sky. "Come on, sit down!" Mariah looked up and let out a sigh of relief, running his hands through his hair and touching his ram-like horns on top of his head. "Thank gods," Mariah laughed. "He hasn't stopped talking about his wife since we've been here." "Hey!" Belvy smirked, pointing the bottle to his friend. "When I marry somebody, I want the whole world to know how much I love them." "Does it have to be forever?" Belvy puffed out his chest and lifted a bronze chain of 2 dull silver rings tied around them, ones that didn't match the new shiny gold band around his ring finger. "Till death takes me away. He's allowed to brag during his honeymoon phase," Orlean assured, finding a spot in the patch of grass next to his party. Belvy shot a smug smile as Mariah rolled his eyes to the sky. "Tell that to my burn marks," Mariah muttered under his breath to Orlean. Orlean gently patted him on the shoulder as the two chuckled together. LaRouche sat down with the others, cracking their book, and started to read, occasionally looking up from their small world when the conversation reached a crescendo or provide little magical sparks to entertain themselves. The four traded talks and reflection on their journey. Orlean could feel his chest and legs feeling warm the longer he sat and chatted. From the corner of his eyes, he could have sworn that the morning glories were blooming around them, a sweet fragrance filling his nose and weighing in the inside of his throat. "Hey," Orlean spoke, glancing over at LaRue. "Weren't we doing something?" The group seemed to freeze for a moment. The sudden interject halted Belvy and Mariah's conversation about not splitting up the party when alone in a haunted house. The two glanced over at LaRue, who kept a steady smile, their eyes still as they looked over their book. "Just enjoy Just enjoy your day off, buddy," LaRue assured. "You've been working too hard." Orlean let out a laugh, grabbing a spare bottle of alcohol. The others laughing along, slipping back on the bright smiles and conversation. "Yeah, I guess you're right." Orlean nodded, taking a sip. Orlean waited for the burning sting of alcohol to crash against his lips. He was never much of a fan of alcohol. He only drank when the other members did so. It would always curdle against his stomach and leave a bad aftertaste. But what came was the taste of sweet honey rose-hip tea, his favorite. Orlean would always have some when he woke up and before he fell asleep. It always reminded him of home, his wife, and his children. Orlean glanced over at LaRue, who kept their eyes down in their book. You should come visit my family. My kids would love to see you again." LaRue's fingers slipped on the page of their book and cut themselves on the paper. They clamped down on their tongue to keep their face straight, to keep the mask they had constructed so well. Their first instincts were to keep their eyes down, pretend to read and memorize spells, keep their eyes off the spell that made their stomach churn by merely peeking at it. LaRue took in the phantom air and hoisted a smile, a painful, tense smile. "Sure, I'd love to." Orlean's smile took a different form, from a cheery disposition to a doleful grin. Orlean nodded as he turned around and joined the conversation with Belvy and Mariah. The shadowed smile on their face felt poisonous. They wanted to throw up, but they didn't want to ruin this. They need to keep this illusion going as long as possible. The real world was not like the dream Orlean and the party were in. It was not filled with grass, flowers, or laughter, but smoke, blood, and pain. The worn-down chamber was filled with smoke and the smell of charred flesh. The air burned and grated against any lungs that breathed into it. The group was scattered, the aftermath of the fight scarring the silence that hung over them. The sound of heels clicking the ground percussioned the chamber, a dark, thick chuckle falling after the footsteps. Moriah was struggling to stay standing. His armor was dented and missing chunks of his breastplate. His limbs felt like they were encased in tar, heavy and trying to sink to the ground. Moriah's sword was plunged to the ground as a makeshift cane, his vision slightly blurry but fixed on a feminine figure walking away, trails of purplish fire following after her as a small crown gleamed against the dark light. Moriah spat out a thick red liquid that was building in his mouth. He wanted to shout. He wanted to chase after her. Moriah wanted to stop this nightmare, but his body couldn't follow through. It had no more energy. His strength used for spells and channeling his god to save his friends. All he could do is watch the woman leave. Moriah tried to squeeze his vocal cords into forming words, a name, to tell her to stay, come back, to demand why. But his throat gave up, using all the energy he had left to keep the air circulating to his lungs. Belvy was on the ground, struggling to get up. His arms felt like boulders as he tried to push himself up. His muscles were trying to rethread themselves together after being torn from under his skin. He clamped his jaw tight as his body was shaking, surges of thunder and fire pulsating against his veins, his neck twitching, the bones cracking as he clenched the earth. Belvy could feel the surge coming from his eyes, stinging his vision as he clenched his eyelids. From the reflection of his glasses, he could see the sickly crimson iris trying to bleed into the plain black iris he had left.
"Let me out!"
A voice screamed in his thoughts.
"Let me make her pay. Let me share the pain you've all received. Let me out, Belvy! Let me—"
"Shut up!" Belvy coughed, slamming his fist into the stone floor, the surface spindling to fresh crack. "I'm in charge, remember?"
"What about Odolith?"
Belvy swung another hand and cracked the ground. He was sure he broke a bone in his hand, but it was worth it. It silenced the voice. The rush of fire and thunder subsided, and a cold blanket of ice crashed against his back, his eyes returning to their mismatched form. His oldest friend had left him be, for now. LaRue was only a few feet away from the rest of the party. They were doing their best from collapsing, their wounds and flesh cindered and twisted, their chest heaving, trying to capture air that escaped their lungs, catch their breath so they can focus. Inside, they felt they had enough energy for one more powerful spell, and they had to keep concentration. This was the most important spell they had casted in their life. Fingernails digging and ripping the cover. One hand was clutching their spellbook, and the other on the chest of a wounded, bloodied Orlean. His chest slowly breathing, trickles of blood seeping out from the pressed hand of LaRue. Orlean's face covered in slashes and deep purplish lines, his eyes blocked out with a white haze frosting over them. With every second that passed, Orlean's breath got shallower. "I'm so glad all of you are here," Orlean said softly, a smile forming through the gashes. The sentence felt like poison to LaRue's stomach. Their hearts squirmed, trying to run from this moment. They should have made everyone run. This wasn't a fight any of them wanted to be in. LaRue took in a long breath and pressed harder into Orlean's wound to stop the bleeding, ignoring the pain that was circulating in their stomach. They had to focus. They had to keep this illusion up for their best friend. "Yeah," LaRue choked, shoving the tears back. "Me too." Orlean's eyes started to flicker, his breath lessening. The tide of his breath reached a final climax before receding. "Thank you," Orlean whispered, his eyelids closing for the last time. Orlean the fighter, husband, father, and friend, had died in LaRue's arms. A piece of LaRue cracked as they felt the life leave the body of the man that was once Orlean. It fell into a black hole, numbing everything, just for a second. Perhaps there was a spell they could still use, a spare healing potion they forgot about, a deal they could make with a god or demon. But nothing was there. Then everything came back. A tsunami of emotions came barreling through, breaking their chest, overriding their senses, taking their throat and letting out a cry that could shatter the sky. The muscles around LaRue's throat started to tear and strain from the explosion escaping their mouth. Hot tears stung their eyes as they rained down, flooding their vision, leaving behind the last smile they would see from their closest friend. Thank you all so much for listening to the end of the story. If you like what you heard, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe. Ring the bell so you can be notified when new stories arrive. If you wish to follow more of the Fighter Saga, then please consider following me on TikTok, where I tell the story of the fighter and the next generation to come. Or you can read the short story that I have read all for you on my Wattpad. Special shout out to Stephen Fawn, Adam Gollinger, Parker Evans, Isabel Rakimoff, Crystal Oldman, Azur Alakaverwin, Bobby Joe Casto, Tabitha Elizabeth Allison Trammell, and Tanisha Kaneda. And if you want your names to be shouted out at the end of these tales, then consider being a member of my Patreon, where you get access to special benefits and stories as well. Thank you all for attending my story. Please stay safe out there, and remember, be kind to yourself.